Santa Maria e coordenador técnico do Congresso APSU América. Pesquisador do CNPq, coordenador do mestrado profissional em agricultura de precisão e líder do renomado projeto Aquários. Com mais de 230 artigos publicados, Dr. Telmo é referência nacional e internacional em agricultura de precisão. Com a palavra, o moderador, Dr. Telmo Amado, que fará a introdução do palestrante e conduzirá os trabalhos desta sessão.
Bom dia a todos, sejam muito bem-vindos. Eu vou pedir permissão para quebrar um pouquinho o protocolo e, já que está todo mundo com vontade de se mexer, eu queria, neste momento, pedir para todos os agricultores e empresários agrícolas para ficarem de pé. Os agricultores e empresários agrícolas que estão presentes, queria uma salva de palmas a esses agricultores. Muito obrigado pela presença de vocês. Queria solicitar agora que os professores e estudantes e delegações aqui presentes levantassem, por favor. Todos os estudantes e professores, uma salva de palmas para esse é o futuro da agricultura de precisão. Queria solicitar que os representantes do sistema cooperativo, todos aqueles que são ligados às cooperativas agrícolas que são tão importantes para nós no Brasil, ficassem de pé, por favor. Associados, representantes, isso aí mesmo. Muito importante, uma salva de palmas. Aos representantes da indústria de máquinas agrícolas e o setor privado de empresas dedicadas ao agro e agricultura de precisão. Por favor, levantem. Nosso reconhecimento. A delegação especial que está de verde aí do Senar-Farsul, por favor, levantem para a gente homenageá-los. E, finalmente, aos consultores e prestadores de serviço em agricultura de precisão que fazem esse serviço chegar até a ponta. Por favor, uma salva de palmas para eles. Muito bem. O que eu quis demonstrar com isso? Nesse auditório está representada toda a cadeia produtiva. E essa união nossa é que vai fazer a diferença nos próximos anos. Mas nós temos a satisfação de trazer para vocês a nossa palestra magna. Liderados pela Teodora, nós estamos, a comissão organizadora, trabalhando há 2 anos para fazer esse evento. E com a ajuda do Alain, do Márcio e do professor Christian, nós temos a honra de convidar o Dr. Steve Phillips. Come to the stage, please. Dr. Steve Phillips é nada mais, nada menos que o presidente da Sociedade Internacional de Agricultura de Precisão. Então, esse aqui é o número 1 no mundo aí em agricultura de precisão. Vinda dele ao Brasil, Bill Round, ele me presenteou, a mim e ao professor Santi, com um Green Seeker para a gente começar as pesquisas de agricultura de precisão. Bom, o Dr. Phillips, então, ele tem mais de 20 anos de experiência com agricultura de precisão, trabalhando na academia e na indústria. Ele já fez palestras em mais de 20 países e autor de mais de 200 artigos técnicos e científicos sobre agricultura de precisão. It's an honor to have you among us. The stage is yours. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Telmo. Bom dia a todos. I've been working in Brazil with different organizations for about 15 years, and I've known of APSUL for many years, and so it's an honor to be invited. Telmo, Teodora, thank you very much for this opportunity. You see from the title that I'm going to speak about lessons learned, particularly from the North American precision ag perspective. And I think that topic is appropriately titled for this presentation because every time I come to Brazil, I learn something that I can take back. I spent the last 4 years before I came to Oklahoma State, where I am now, working in Africa, particularly in Morocco and throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And they had a lot of activities going on in research, in service, in academia, but it was very disorganized. There was no structure at all. And I thought about my experience as I've traveled around the world for 20 years working in precision agriculture at all different scales of operation. Where did I see the smartest structural or infrastructural organization? And it was here in Brazil. Years ago, through the formation of ASBRAP, the Service Providers Association, the connection between the science and the practice and the delivery of solutions to growers, I felt represented as well as anywhere in the world the pathway to a successful program. And I know you're still growing in a lot of areas, but I have used Brazil as an example in Africa of how to build an infrastructure and a precision ag community, rather than just a project here or a service provided here, but an overall ecosystem of precision ag. So congratulations to you for being an example to me that I've been able to learn from and grow with over the past 20 years. So congratulations to you. Getting into the talk today, I'm going to start with one of the things that, even before we get into talking about technologies, that decades past we had this thing. What is that? Well, most people agriculture was. And we worked together globally to come up with this definition that precision agriculture is a management strategy. What we're trying to do is recognize sources of spatial and temporal variability that are affecting our production. Now you'll notice the one word that doesn't appear in this definition is technology. Technology and precision ag tools give us the ability to put into practice this management strategy that deals with spatial and temporal variability. And so today I'm going to talk a lot about different tools and adoption patterns and trends that we've seen throughout the history of precision ag in North America. But keep in mind that what we're really trying to do in precision ag is manage the variability, both inherent and man-made, that's affecting our productivity in our fields, our efficiency of our inputs, and our overall profitability as agricultural practitioners. I'm going to show several graphs that look like this today, and so I'm going to explain to you first what this is. These are adoption statistics that are collected by a group at Purdue University every year from precision ag service providers. These are not adoptions by farmers, but rather services that are made available to farmers through various providers. These providers are largely in the Midwest region or the Corn Belt of the United States, but we also have representation from the South, the Midwest, and the western part of the United States. Across the bottom, you'll see these are the years that we've been conducting this survey. And you can see that we go back almost 25 years now that we've been collecting this. So we're fortunate in the United States to have this rich history of adoption trends. On the left axis will be the percentage of service providers in this survey that offer this service. And so these axes labels will be the same for all these graphs. What's more important than annual variation, because there are a lot of factors that affect year to year. So what's important to pay attention to is the general trend and the growth, and in particular, in the case of the United States, a flattening or a maturity of that particular market, where we feel like we've kind of settled in on some of these technology adoption trends and don't expect to see a lot more growth there. This first one, we're looking at guidance. The first two bars, the black and the green, represent guidance and sprayer control. Now, we saw a little bit of jump around 2010. That was where we had been using manual guidance, and that big jump in 2010 is up to auto guidance. And this was one of the first things we learned when it comes to technology adoption, is that just because we see a dip in survey trends doesn't necessarily mean that that's no longer being adopted. What happened is we saw a large dip in manual guidance, but at the same time, there was also an increase. These producers weren't giving up on guidance, they were switching from manual to automated. So it's important when you look at survey data like this to remember the context in which it's created. We don't always survey the same dealers. There's change in customer base. And so there's a lot of things that go into these graphs that we need to be aware of. But we've seen a maturing in the market of auto guidance and sprayer control. We're seeing continued growth in telemetry and fleet management. I see this as one that's going to continue to grow for us. Most dealers that I talk to have some level of this. We're only showing about 50%, but this is a very popular digital management strategy that service providers are using, our fleet management. The bottom red line is the sprayer compensation, turn compensation. This is where when the sprayer is turning, that means it's spraying a lot heavy right in the middle. It's going faster on the outside of the boom. And so we have compensation now to manage that so it remains with the correct rate as the sprayer moves around the field. So these are technologies that are very rapidly adopted because they don't require a lot of calibration. They're ready to go. The return on the investment is very quickly recognizable to the service provider. To the grower, it's often reduced inputs, particularly in sprayer control, section control. We don't over apply, we don't double apply. We're eliminating skips and overlaps with our inputs. And so these are usually more readily adopted. When we look at other things like more of the practices, we see that these sometimes take a little longer because there's more agronomic support. There's more understanding of how it's working rather than just to turn it on and watch it go. On the top, you can see the most highly adopted is precision soil sampling. This is either grid sampling, zone sampling, but some sort of geo-referenced soil sample collection in the field. The second are yield monitors. That's another one that's fairly stabilized for us, both in practice and in service providers. We've had yield monitors since the mid-90s. Most new combines are going to come already equipped with a monitor, and so it's pretty well standard practice now that most growers will have monitored yield in their fields. The blue bars that both the dashed and the solid represent satellite and drone imagery. This is what we see happening like we did with guidance. We had a lot more service providers offering satellite imagery, which have now started to transition to drones. Now, in this particular graph, you can see we're projecting out to 2026, with the drone imagery expected to increase considerably. The last data collected was 2024. We haven't really seen that take off like we thought. The United States was a little late, relatively speaking, into the drone business because of federal aviation regulations and the legality of flying drones for commercial services in the U.S. And so our dealers were very anxious. They were waiting. They just knew this was something they were going to have a good business with. And it came, and they started getting a bunch of pictures, and then it was kind of like the yield monitors. Well, we have a picture now. What do we do with it from a management standpoint? So again, the growers are happy to see this variation in their field, but what do we do about that? What does that mean to me in terms of a management practice? And so we're still trying to figure some of that out. And that's similar to the story, Telmo, or Professor Amato mentioned the Green Seeker that I worked on when I was in graduate school. That bottom solid green line are the chlorophyll sensors, the green seekers, the crop circles, all of these. And what's interesting about this, you see the projected growth there. Since we started including this in the survey in 2010, and the Green Seeker's been commercially available since 2001. So almost 25 years you've been able to buy Green Seekers. In 2010, they started measuring it. Every year, dealers say, oh yeah, this is going to go up. This is going to go up to 10, 15%. It's going to go up to 25%. Every year, dealers say, oh yeah, we're going to be running more Green Seekers, and then they don't. We've been sitting right here around 20% of dealerships for years, but they still, you can see, they're still optimistic about this technology, which is interesting because it works quite well for us. We're well calibrated. In Oklahoma, where it was developed, we probably have as many growers that are using Green Seeker-based nitrogen reference strips to make their in-season nitrogen recommendations on wheat and corn than anywhere in the country. But they're not using the Green Seeker to apply it. They're using it more as a diagnostic tool rather than a variable rate application tool. And so it's been interesting to watch this technology, being personally involved with it. The newest things we've got coming are the robotics coming. I'll talk more about that this afternoon in the panel when we're thinking more future of precision ag in the U.S. But these are areas, robotics and automation, the See and Spray type technologies, EcoSpray, I think is Stara's version of it. So these we'll see coming much more rapidly in the next few years. And variable rate fertilization. This is one that I've been heavily involved with over the years. Particularly in fertilizer, you can see again, we're a fairly mature market in terms of service provision here. It's about 80 to 90% of dealerships are equipped with variable rate fertilizer applicators. And so we're very mature there. We started with lime. That was the first thing that we were doing regularly on a variable rate basis. And that continues to be at about 70% of dealerships. Variable rate seed. We thought this would be more popular than it has been. It took off pretty quick, as you can see there, about 2012, and then leveled off. Never did reach the same adoption rate that the fertilizer and lime have. And then pesticides, again, pretty stable, but not highly adopted. And then that pink bar that you see, the projected growth, that's application with drones. Again, we're very optimistic about the potential for drones here. Since this is 2023, over the past 2 years, it's been flat. It's still been about 30%. We're not seeing the growth that the dealers anticipated we would. Again, a lot of that's got to do with calibration, with the agronomy that goes into these technologies. terms of profitability, here we are going back 25 years. This is the percentage of dealers that report a profitable service. They're making money on variable rate fertilizer, precision soil sampling, yield monitors, drone images. Again, not as many making money yet, but again, I think it's only a matter of time before we figure out how to support the service with the science. And that's one of the biggest lessons that we've learned, unfortunately, the hard way in the case of several technologies in the United States, is that engineering and marketing can move a lot faster than science. And so that relationship between the academics and the service providers and the equipment companies and the financial people, the government in terms of program support and cost share, this whole ecosystem, we were out of sync for many years. And so we had a lot of good technologies available, but farmers weren't using it because the companies couldn't support it. The scientists knew we were onto something, but still needed more time to make the algorithms and the calibrations all work. And so it was that lack of synchronous relationships that we've actually gotten a lot better with in the U.S. in the last few years. Variable rate is something that we understand why it's so well adopted, because the benefits are obvious in the case of lower costs, particularly in reduction of inputs, higher yields. We're redistributing those inputs into areas of the field where we get better response. It's lower risk. Here's an example of one of my experimental fields that we used where we're applying MAP, monoammonium-phosphate, 1152O. And if we would have applied the single rate to the whole field, now this is an interesting case, and one that when I get to the disadvantages of variable rate, I'll revisit. We didn't really change the total rate applied in the field. It was about the same rate that we would have put. But if we'd have made a single uniform application to the entire field, only 60% of it would have actually received the rate it needed. 20% would have been under-fertilized by as much as 17%, and about 20% would have been over-fertilized by 28%. So in some areas of the field, we're losing yield. Other areas of the field, we're spending money on fertilizer we don't need. And so the benefits are clear to us in terms of variable rate fertilizer application. Now this graph, you see a percent of producers on the left. This is not actual farmer adoption. I'll show you some farmer adoption data this afternoon during the panel. This is the percentage of area served by these dealerships. You saw 92% of the dealerships have variable rate applications, but only about 40 to 50% of their clients are using these services. So if every dealer's got it, and we know well what the benefits are, why aren't more growers using it? Well, there are several disadvantages, and this is other things that we've become more aware of and more
aprendemos mais e descobrimos mais, estamos reconhecendo nos Estados Unidos, na última década, o retorno sobre o investimento é difícil de calcular, né? Se nós economizamos dinheiro no fertilizante, isso é uma coisa óbvia para a gente, mas é como o exemplo que eu mostrei no slide anterior, onde nós não cortamos a taxa de fertilizante, nós somente movimentamos. Agora vamos ter que ter outra métrica de desempenho para determinar se nós movimentamos nos locais. Vamos ter que corresponder ao mapa de rendimento. Vamos dizer, vamos ter que ter diferentes camadas de informações para saber se gerou dinheiro para o agricultor. Esse é o nosso desafio do provedor de serviço. E também, no prazo, quando nós produzimos isso nos Estados Unidos, as primeiras vezes que nós fizemos, nós induzimos o agricultor quando excessivo vai por medida distribuíram o campo, o prazo esse desafio. As eficiências são muito pequenas. Sobre nutrientes, mas é, quando nós temos
This was accurate. Very
muito as coisas para precisar que nós estamos isso
how we
realmente aqui
in here.
eu,
This is good.
eu não vou temos os
Basically,
realmente nós falamos calibração primeiramente área os mapas
And so within this correlation calibration system, there are things we have, there are still things we need when we start talking about precision agriculture. What we have is that we can vary fertilizer at a very fine resolution in the field. The technology on the applicators is there both for dry and liquid. So start a new sprayer on the same applicator, we can go dry and liquid. And so the technology, the application technology is there. But what we can't do is make the prescription map at the same resolution that we have the ability to treat it. Because here's an example, when we go into the field, you can see what we estimated each of these grid cells to need in terms of potassium and what it actually needed. We're way off sometimes because, again, we're trying to use a tool built for accuracy at a very high resolution precision application.
Uma outra coisa que nós fazemos, não fazemos recomendações nos pontos interpretados, porque nós temos um valor medido de solo, nós temos estatística para estimar qual é o nível de teste de sal seria entre aquele ponto e o próximo ponto dentro desta grade, né? E o que nós descobrimos é que pode haver muita variabilidade entre dois pontos que talvez não estejam muito distantes. Então, o que nós precisamos para fazer um trabalho melhor, né? O que nós precisamos caracterizar a necessidade de nutrientes ao ver do suprimento de nutrientes. Houve alguns comentários sobre isso hoje de manhã também, falando sobre a remoção dos nutrientes, mas a quantidade de nutrientes que são necessários para chegar àquele nível de rendimento. À medida que nós vemos melhoria genética em várias culturas e o rendimento aumentando, nós tivemos que recalibrar, né, até mesmo no nível de acurácia aceita, vários estados recalibraram, especialmente com potássio. Nós vemos muitas mudanças em algodão, por exemplo, então variedades de esterco, então, e tudo é configurado no início na temporada, né? Uma quantidade suficiente de potássio. Então, agora no ciclo de crescimento, agora o potássio estará lá, mas não está lá no momento que nós precisamos por causa de mudanças genéticas da planta. Nós tivemos que repensar as nossas recomendações, mas em termos de necessidade de nutrientes ao invés de suprimento de nutrientes, e nós precisamos interpretar estes resultados no nível de precisão que vamos tentar aplicá-los. Se nós soubermos que uma grade de 1 hectare não está com muita variabilidade entre os pontos, nós temos que pensar se vamos utilizar o teste de solo indo para uma resolução mais alta, porque é um custo maior, leva mais tempo. Quando falamos sobre esses rendimentos no Brasil, onde 20 hectares é o tamanho da grade, né, o tamanho do talhão, o que isso nos diz sobre a nossa capacidade de ser preciso com as recomendações baseadas no nutrientes de solo. Na verdade, é uma coisa desafiadora. E, finalmente, nós temos que fazer recomendações melhores com base na precisão que estamos buscando. Nós temos que ser capazes de entrar, ter uma resolução que nos permite fazer a aplicação e ter um diagnóstico adequado e uma aplicação adequada. Então, nós fizemos um outro experimento, isso foi provavelmente em 2015, nós começamos em 2013, 2015, quando nós entrávamos nos campos, na parte central dos Estados Unidos, em Kentucky, Oklahoma, em Kansas, e nós fizemos a amostragem em grades, né, em talhões, em 400 metros, em 0,4 hectares. Daí nós fizemos de interpretações até 1 hectare, que é o nosso tamanho padrão de área, né? E nós queríamos saber qual é a resposta. Nós somos melhores capazes de capturar a possível responsividade para uma aplicação com uma área de maior resolução. E a história curta nesses dados é o seguinte, né? E neste grande gráfico, esse é teste de solo, né? Este é nível de teste de solo, isso é rendimento relativo. Esse é o nível crítico, essa linha vermelha. No lado esquerdo, nós esperaríamos uma resposta, uma coisa acima da linha pontilhada, né? E no lado direito, nós esperaríamos que estaria perto da linha azul, que está, mas olha na esquerda, né? Basicamente, estes dados estão nos dizendo que não importa qual seja a resolução, nós podemos chegar até 400 metros quadrados e ainda assim só vamos prever de forma com acurácia a resposta de fósforo na metade do tempo. É como jogar uma moeda. Se o fertilizante vai resultar no aumento no rendimento ou não. Isso foi uma preocupação para a gente, porque nós construímos o sistema com base em acurácia. Bom, tudo bem, se vai ser mais ou menos 30 quilos, tudo bem, num determinado ano, nós temos acurácia. Quando olhamos para o sistema de recomendação, num nível muito alto de precisão, que nós descobrimos que nós estamos fazendo um bom trabalho, tentando fazer com que o sistema funcione. Quando é construído para curar, se estamos fazendo isso para precisão, o gráfico mostra diferentes níveis de teste de solo, a disseminação, o espalhamento dos dados. Você pode ver que fica menor e menor à medida que aumenta o nível do teste, né? O sistema ficou muito bom de não vamos ter uma resposta, não precisamos de fertilizante. Às vezes é 30% ou 40% do campo, então nós fazemos um bom trabalho ali, nós fazemos um bom trabalho e ao chegarmos mais perto do nível crítico, mas chegamos naquela zona responsiva, há muita coisa ocorrendo e isso foi mencionado hoje de manhã, estamos discutindo um fator químico aqui, mas há fatores físicos, há fatores biológicos, há interações desses fatores, todas essas coisas afetam a responsividade da cultura à aplicação daquele fertilizante. E estamos certos no que estamos medindo. Estamos medindo a quantidade correta de fósforo que está lá, estamos calibrados quando dizemos, neste nível, essa quantidade de fertilizante que precisamos, mas a calibração que estamos aplicando para todo este campo na média está incorreta. Nós precisamos de uma calibração mais específica para cada local do que temos atualmente. Isso também foi mencionado hoje de manhã, que uma das nossas hipóteses, ao tentar entender esses dados e aplicar, e por que nós estamos tendo um bom desempenho ao prever a resposta, é que estamos considerando somente a quantidade de fósforo na amostra do solo. Então, e a profundidade entre 15 a 30 centímetros, normalmente depende da cultivação do sistema, né? Mas há fatores que limitam o rendimento. Há camadas restritivas de raízes no sistema que estão impedindo que aquela cultura cresça. Pessoas mencionaram doenças, compactação, acidez do solo, várias coisas foram mencionadas hoje, né? E nosso grupo seguiu esse pensamento com os dados, que há coisas ocorrendo também que estão afetando como a cultura vai responder ao fertilizante que nós aplicamos, né? E não o teste que nós fazemos. Então, o que nós precisamos fazer para medir este fósforo? O que nós aprendemos que um hectare, essa é uma discussão que eu vi aqui no Brasil também, com o tamanho grande da área, ainda é melhor, se você tiver uma amostra em 20 hectares, seja uma unidade pequena que você pode medir independentemente. Em estatística, vão dizer, é inútil porque não é válido estatisticamente. Esses pontos são muito afastados, mas de um ponto prático, qualquer informação que você puder obter é melhor do que nenhuma informação, né, num campo. Então, é isso que nós estamos tentando fazer, né? Nós precisamos ser... Nós aceitamos o fato que o nosso sistema atual de recomendação não funciona muito bem quando aplicamos em subcampos. Então, temos que ter mais informações. Essa é a pergunta que temos que fazer. O que mais nós precisamos? O que nós precisamos, ao invés do nosso sistema de teste tradicional de solo, para fazer essas recomendações num nível específico de subcampo? Há várias coisas que estamos utilizando, né? Esses são dados baseados no que vocês estão utilizando, além de um teste de solo para criar as suas zonas de manejo nos Estados Unidos. Então, nós temos mapas de solo que são baseados na mudança de série do solo. Nós temos mapa de condutividade elétrica, outras imagens, os sistemas Green Seeker, satélites, imagem de drone, DDI, o que nós utilizamos mais comumente, mas temos várias coisas já sendo utilizadas. Aqui nós temos exemplos de um dos problemas. Aqui nós temos uma imagem aérea de um campo no leste dos Estados Unidos. Se eu olhar para isso, eu vou pensar, tudo bom. São duas zonas de manejo, está muito claro, parece duas zonas, mas se eu não tivesse essas imagens e eu retirasse o mapa do solo, bom, há três, na verdade, 3 zonas ali. Tem duas, tem aquela série de transição que foi mapeada de forma diferente. eu ia fazer o manejo de acordo com isso, mas eu tenho 3 zonas de manejo. Se nós colocarmos uma outra camada de dados ali, bom, agora nós temos mapas de rendimento, agora eu vou começar a pensar, bom, isto são mais ou menos 2 zonas de manejo. Então, o mapa de
getting us there. So now we're starting to see things yield-related that may not require a soil test. Here's another example. I mentioned sometimes the maps don't line up. This is looking at the soil map, the yield map, the elevation map, and then the fertilizer as applied map. You can see the discrepancies there. So what we need to start doing is figuring out how to mine data through multiple layers of information to build a solution, a site-specific solution for these growers. And we'll talk more about that in the panel this afternoon. We'll get into some of the opportunities for AI and moving into more data-driven solutions in agriculture. Here's another example of some research I did when we started thinking about these different layers and how to zone these fields differently. This is a farm that's about, this one is about 55 hectares in size. So pretty similar to what I'm understanding a lot of these fields here in Rio Grande do Sul would be like. This is the soil map. A lot of different soils, and we know some things about these soils, and we know they have inherently different production potentials, water holding capacity, nutrient supplying power, a lot of built-in differences. But what this farmer has done is collected yield maps over the rotation. This is a wheat, double crop soybean, corn rotation, so 3 crops in 2 years. He kept 4 years of every crop that he harvested off that field and built these maps and found that there were areas around the perimeter of their field that never make the field average. They make, on average, about 80% of the field. But then there are other areas that make 120%. So multiple years, multiple crops, multiple seasons, he begins to understand the productivity of his field. So we can create this productivity map. Now we can come in, understanding the productivity and looking at the nutrient removal. Now he's gotten away from soil testing because he doesn't have a separate calibration for all those different soils. He knows they're different in terms of the crop's ability to respond to fertilizer. But this farmer feels like the nutrient removal. Now, as the speaker accurately mentioned this morning, maintenance only works if you've already satisfied the soil's requirement for that. Because particularly in phosphorus, which has a tremendous affinity for soil and other nutrients in the system, we need to understand the dynamics and the cycling in this, but this farmer has gone to more of a nutrient removal. Now, the next question we ask, and we talked a little bit about this morning, is, well, what's causing these fields? We know it's not nutrients. We've sampled this field. We're meeting the nutrient needs. What else could be driving? And it's this depth to limiting layer that was mentioned this morning. There are several characteristics. We've done an experiment, and I'll show you these data, but we've defined what is a limiting layer, and we look at these soil cores. It's got to be at least 25 centimeters thick. A clay layer of greater than 35% we would consider to be restrictive to root growth, soil structure, soil depth, compaction, and then other characteristics. Some of these concretions, mineral concretions, salinity. We mentioned acidity earlier this morning. A lot of these will also be limiting layers for root penetration, productivity, and overall plant growth. And so what we did is we went into 2 farmers' fields in Oklahoma. This is recent data. And we looked at their yield maps, their natural variation in yield. And so we went around and we sampled where the yields were. We took about 1.2 meter soil cores, and we characterized those profiles, and we're able to plot the depth to the limiting layer on the x-axis and productivity or yield on the y-axis. And what you see is we get linear relationships in wheat at both farms between the depth to limiting layer and yield. Now these fields also were rotating with soybean, and what's interesting, these are the same fields, the same course, the same sample points, and you notice on the two farms the wheat curves were very similar, but now we have a distinct separation in these two fields, which tells us that it's not enough to just understand that there is a limiting layer present, but the type of layer, I think, now is going to matter depending on the crop. Wheat seemed to be equally affected in both of these farms, but the soybean responded very differently. And so the next stage of this research, we're looking at more clearly identifying exactly what is that limiting layer and how we would expect it to affect different crops. We're looking at this now in a wheat double crop soybean, wheat double crop sorghum, wheat double crop corn.
Com trigo e com sorgo e trigo de temporada completa. Então a gente quer fazer uma análise mais aprofunda quanto a rotações e assim por diante. Então a gente acha que talvez a gente vai ter esses dados, talvez pode estar aqui dentro a resposta. Então a última coisa que eu queria fazer, e nós falamos sobre tendências de adoção e pesquisas e as importâncias, a importância de conectar a prática e a ciência.
One of the things that we wanted to do for several years in the International Society of Precision Ag is bring the International Conference of Precision Ag to Brazil. And so I'm very happy to announce that this July we'll be partnering with ASBRAP to make a joint conference of CONBAP, which you're all familiar with,
da
and
CONBAP,
the International Conference of Precision Ag.
Na Conferência Internacional. Os abstratos vocês vão estar aberto para vocês inscreverem seus abstratos. Vai ter que ser em inglês, mas pode mandar por Google Translate. Você pode apresentar em português se quiser, ou espanhol. Vamos ter tradução, intérpretes nas principais sessões para inglês, português e espanhol. E vamos ter sessões à parte para menores, para falantes de português, espanhol e inglês, respectivamente. Então, está uma plateia muito grande aqui. Eu espero que todos vocês possam ir para Porto Alegre. Vamos voltar aqui para o Sul em julho. Então, agradeço sua atenção. E com isso eu concluo meus comentários. Muito obrigado. Tem sido um prazer. Eu espero ver vocês de novo de tarde.
Congratulations. Vamos já passar para os mimos, mas eu queria reforçar um ponto da palestra, né, de que nós temos que conhecer a variabilidade dos nossos solos, tratá-las de acordo com essa variabilidade, mas não esquecer que a planta ela precisa ter um solo saudável para que aquela variabilidade que nós corrigimos possa ser aproveitada pela planta.